Today is part 5 of our five-part series in the book of Lamentations. And we need to begin today's sermon with a bit of a recap. So if you've been to those previous sermons, then we can catch you up to speed. Sometime around the year 1000 BCE, there was 12 tribes of Israel, and they were consolidated by a man named Saul, who then formed the nation of Israel. Arthur, could you switch the presentation display to the sermon, please? Thanks, that'll make it a little easier for me. People think that I have stuff memorized. The truth is, if this all shuts down, it's hopeless. Like, I'll just stand up here and be like, I don't know how I feel about anything. So 3,000 years ago, a man named Saul united the 12 tribes of Israel and formed the nation of Israel. He was violently overthrown by a man named David, whose son, a man named Solomon, ended up building the temple around the year 950 BCE. Now, this temple represented much more than a building. This building was a promise, because the whole idea was that this was the very house of God. And the promise that was represented in this is that this building said that God is with us as a nation, and God will live with us as we go in and out of our daily lives. And God is so powerful that God will protect us, and nothing will ever happen to God's house, because that's where God lives. So this building was a promise. And the promise more or less worked for the next 400 years, until the year 586 BCE, when a superpower rose to the east known as Babylon, launched a military campaign against Jerusalem and fought against the people of Israel, which was then called Judah, and destroyed Judah, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and more importantly, the temple. Now, this was a massive theological crisis. And in the midst of this theological crisis, the Babylonians then took all of the survivors of Judah back with them across the desert and forced them to live in exile in Babylon as Babylonian citizens. Now, while they are in exile, there is this sense of disbelief, because they cannot believe that God allowed God's house to fall. And once God's house fell, there was this sense of, wow, did God abandon us? And the theological question that arose for the next 47 years was the question, God, where are you? And rather than getting an answer to that question just kept getting asked over and over again for 47 years while the people of Judah lived in exile. Whew, that's tough. And so for that reason, we've gone to the book of Lamentations, which was written sometime during this 47-year window. And we've realized that in the midst of that tough theology, in that tough period, that we found some very tough pieces of scripture. We started in chapter 1 because Lamentations has 5 different poems. And all 5 of these different poems are written probably by different people. Now, we will conclude today's service with something that's known as Tisha B'Av. And Tisha B'Av is a Jewish tradition that commemorates the destruction of the temple. And we've been doing this throughout the series. Today, Youngmin Kim will be reading Lamentations 5. And the way that Tisha B'Av is carried out is that we turn off all the lights and we read the lamentation shrouded in darkness with only candlelight illuminating the text. So we do this because we want to analyze Lamentations 5 first and then feel it when Youngmin Kim reads it. So we're very excited to have Youngmin here, and that's how we'll conclude this series. Now, a bit of a recap. We went all the way from chapter 1 in Lamentations 1. I told a story about how we introduced a lamentation, a song of lamentation to junior senior Bible camp. It was not well received by adults, because that's what adults do. And yet we talked about how this is very much the essence of what the book of Lamentations is. In fact, the thesis of Lamentations, in my opinion, is that God does not answer prayer, which you might feel the same if you were living in exile all those years ago. Then in Lamentations 2, we talked about the movie Cars, and we talked specifically about this poem, which might be the saddest chapter in all of Scripture. And we talked about how, whether we like it or not, at some point, if you are a person of faith, you will experience God betraying you. Happy Sabbath, y'all. Then, on Lamentations 3, I told a story about my son, Bodhi, and kind of the anxiety I had for him in the generations to come and what hope meant. And we talked about how in Lamentations 3, which has the most hopeful passage, there is this moment where we realize that the greatest and deepest form of hope includes the worst of our suffering rather than ignores it. And then last week, Pastor Mandy gave an excellent sermon on Lamentations 4. And in that sermon, she talked about how when we hold space for lamentation, it is an act of defiance against trauma. Now, these are some pretty weighty themes, right? And you may be thinking to yourself, hey, this is a Christian church, and I've seen lots of Christian movies, and those things always end happy. I can't wait, after all these weighty themes that we've been through, to see how this whole thing ends, because clearly it's gotta end on a much happier note, right? Well, let's find out. Let's turn to Lamentations 5, verse 1, where the poet starts with an invitation. The poet writes, "Oh Lord, reflect on what has happened to us, consider and look at our disgrace." Now, this is a bit of a surprising invitation, right? Can you imagine praying to God, "Hey God, can you be a bit more empathetic? Because I don't think you understand what we're going through down here. I want you, God, to think a little bit more about what we're going through, because you clearly don't have the emotional capacity for this." So that's the whole framing of this poem. And this is an introductory invitation that then launches into the body of the poem. And you can find the body of the poem from verses 2 all the way down to 16, where there is a consistent theme, even though the author, the poet, talks about very different things. We read this in verse 2, "Our inheritance is turned over to strangers. Foreigners now occupy our homes. We have become fatherless orphans. Our mothers have become widows. We must pay money for our own water. We must buy our own wood at a steep price. We are pursued. They are breathing down our necks. We are weary and have no rest. We have submitted to Egypt and Assyria in order to buy food to eat." Now, what's interesting about these 5 verses is they seem disconnected, but ultimately it is the poet looking at the world and observing things. All 5 of these verses are observations. And the poet very explicitly talks about what the world is and what the poet is experiencing as reality. And while that is explicitly mentioned, there is also something implicitly mentioned in this passage. Because the implicit note here is that all of these verses implicitly suggest that this is not the way the world should be. So when you look at these verses, it says, "Our inheritance is turned over to strangers." You can tell there's this sense from the poet that we should be able to keep our own inheritance. When foreigners occupy our homes, there is a sense that we should be able to occupy our own homes. There shouldn't be orphans. Women shouldn't become widows. We shouldn't have to pay money for water, and we shouldn't have to pay exorbitant prices for wood. So there's this sense from the poet that he is looking at the world and saying to himself, you know, if God's running the show, something's wrong. God's either not who we thought God was, or God is powerless to get around this. In fact, Lamentations 5 says that if God is in charge, then the world should not be the way that the world is right now. Now, this theme continues all the way down to verse 16. I'm just going to show you 3 other selections of this idea that this is the world and this is not how it should be. Our skin is as hot as an oven due to a fever from hunger. They raped women in Zion, virgins in the town of Judah. Our hearts no longer have any joy. Our dancing is turned to mourning. And after all of these observations and saying this isn't the way the world should be, the poet becomes extremely emotional in verse 17 when the poet writes these words, "Because of this, our hearts are sick. Because of these things, we can hardly see through our tears." Now, this is the emotional low point of this poem. And if you're like me, you're reading this and you're thinking to yourself, wow, we're most of the way through this poem. There's only 5 verses left. How on earth is the author, the poet, going to recover this and make this a happy ending? And if you think to yourself in this moment, at the emotional low point of the poem, I want you to think about how you would end this poem being a good Christian person, right? Because most Christians I know that would write this poem would write it all in the same way. They would go back to the exile and they would say that when everyone was weeping, when everyone was at their lowest point, when everyone started to give up hope, all of a sudden the cavalry arrived from on high. God said, "I'm here." And then explosions started flying from the sky and rained down on Babylon. Yeah! Because we've learned that explosions usually equal justice in our movies, which might be a problem. And so we have this sense that that's what's going to happen. But then we get to the last 5 verses, and they're rather unexpected and often uninvited into modern religious contexts today. Verse 18, let's break this down by verse by verse. These are the last 5 verses of the book of Lamentations. The poet writes, "For wild animals are prowling over Mount Zion, which lies desolate." Now, Zion is where the temple is. And remember, the promise was that God would reign in God's house forever. So when Mount Zion is desolate and there's wild animals running free on it, this verse right here represents a broken promise from God to the people. That's pretty heavy. The very next verse then says, "But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation." Can I get an amen? Yeah, there's some positive stuff. All of a sudden we flip from a broken promise to an eternal promise. What a sudden shift of emotion that is. Then when we think, okay, now we're getting to the happy stuff, why do you keep on forgetting us? Why do you forsake us so long? We have these desperate questions of doubt that show up. And you're like, well, I guess this is going to be a bit of a downer. And then we read the next verse. "Bring us back to yourself, O Lord, so that we may return to you. Renew our life as in days before." And we swing from questions of doubt to a strong statement of hope. And just when we think it's going to end on a hopeful note, the author ends the whole book of Lamentations on this note: "Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure." The end. Now, that word right there, or those verses, that verse is a blinding uncertainty. We can't see past this God. Who knows? Will God help us or will God reject us? Guess we have to wait and find out. And the book ends. My friends, it's important for us to acknowledge that the book of Lamentations ends with a paradox. Now, if you're like me, you look at this paradox and you think, what an interesting artistic choice. Why on earth did this poet end this poem with this paradox? Why on earth did whoever it was that compiled the book of Lamentations and put these 5 poems together, why did they say, yeah, that's the note I want to end on? Unless you have utterly rejected us, God, and are angry with us beyond measure. That's what I want people to walk away with. Why end with a paradox? Well, to answer that question, I want to talk to you a little bit about church. Now, if we talk about church, we have to go back a little bit further before church, back to this exile. And it's here that this question arises, and we ask the question, why is it that there is this paradox that ends the book of Lamentations? Well, when you consider where this book was written, it was written right here through 47 years of unresolved suffering. And there was this prayer that maybe God will come in and fix this problem. But the book of Lamentations was crafted in the shadow of that unresolved suffering. There was this longing to be liberated from the Babylonian people. But the Babylonians had other ideas, and so they wondered year in and year out when this exile would end. Now, this brings us to church. And church is very interesting. Because when we talk about church, if you were to walk into most churches in America today and ask them, what's the point of God? I have a sense that most churches, and you're welcome to disagree with this, I have a sense that most churches would say, you want to know what the point of God is and the point of a spiritual walk with Jesus Christ is? The fact is, if you want to go to heaven, then you need to believe in God. That's the point. That's the purpose of God. And the subversive idea that's below that idea is that there's this idea that the primary work of God is to bring an end to human suffering. So God exists because suffering exists, and God will one day bring that suffering to an end. So the church's primary witness right now in America today is that they are telling the world that the primary work of God is to bring an end to human suffering. But along comes the book of Lamentations, who hears this testimony, and the book of Lamentations says, oh, cool, do you want to hear a story about when God failed to end suffering? And the church typically responds to the book of Lamentations by saying, not now, Lamentations. We're too busy praising God. We don't have time for the stories where God doesn't end suffering. And what's interesting about Lamentations is it's a book about how God failed to end our suffering. And that book is part of a larger book called the Bible. And in the Bible, there is a book called Exodus. Now, most people here know the story of Exodus because it's often frequently told. The story of Exodus begins with people being enslaved, and God hears their cry in the midst of oppression and liberates them with a mighty and miraculous hand. So while Lamentations tells the story of how God failed to end suffering, the book of Exodus tells the story of how God brought an end to our suffering. Now, the church looks at both of these books and says, this weekend, we're talking about Exodus. And next weekend, we'll talk about Exodus again. But when you look at these books, you realize that there is a real contradiction between Exodus and Lamentations, right? One professes how God liberated the Israelites from suffering. The other professes that God did nothing in the midst of Judah's suffering. So which one is it? Does God help those who are suffering, or does God ignore those who are suffering? For me, the question I want to ask to that is, aren't both of these true? Haven't we lived through both of these experiences? Because I will tell you that when I look at how the world works and how life works, there is this real sense that there are these moments where all of a sudden we experience incredible grace, and in those moments of grace, sometimes you can only ascribe it to what people have used the word God to describe. But there are those other moments where everything goes wrong and you wonder why the world is the way it is, and you feel abandoned by God. I think the book of Lamentations ends with a paradox because the human experience is rarely linear, rarely straightforward, rarely easy to explain away, but is frequently ambiguous. Now, this may sound like a lot of heady ideas or whatever, but I want to share with you a very concrete example of how this works. This past weekend, I got to go to Mammoth Mountain with my family, and it was a blast. And there was this moment where I've been going to Mammoth my whole life. I look up, and we're on a bike ride with my family, and I just look at Mammoth, and it is the prettiest I have ever seen it in the middle of summer. And this just took my breath away. The picture does not do it justice. Now, this took place here on this planet just last weekend. And it was a real moment where I was just swept up in the beauty of our experience. And what this tells us is that the world is filled with moments of intense beauty. But if you've been with Paradox before, you know that we also talk about a lot of the problems the world has as well. Because it's in this same world that has moments of intense beauty that we find other moments happening, don't we? Because the world is also filled with moments of intense terror. Now, what happens if we eliminate one or the other of these true statements? Let's say we only got together to talk about the intense beauty that we experience, right? If we just told you that all the time everything's good and all the time everything's good, so that way you should just trust that everything can be good. Well, at that point, you would at some point look at this church and say, this is shallow naivete. Conversely, if you eliminated the good and only talked about the moments of sheer terror, and only talked about how the world is going to hell in a handbasket and how things are never going to work out and nothing good ever happens, at some point you realize that it's just as shallow on the other side, and that we would be a group that would be obsessed with superficial cynicism. Because we'd say, I'm not sure there's anything worth doing, why don't we just sit and complain about everything? So we have these two truths that exist together, and there is a third way that reveals itself when we hold both of them in tension and accept them as our reality. Rather than trying to resolve one or the other, we accept both as what it means to be human. And when we talk about the book of Lamentations ending with this paradox, there is something about holding to this idea that God both fails to end our suffering and God also ends our suffering at the same time. And the paradox that the poet comes up with, in my opinion, is brilliant. Lamentations 5:18-22, these last 5 verses contain a broken promise, an eternal promise, questions of doubt, statements of hope, and blinding uncertainty. And when I look at those 5 different things, I look at it and I ask myself a question. Does all of this sound like anyone else's life, or is it just me? Do you have moments of hope buttressed up against moments of doubt? Do you have moments of love buttressed up against moments of hatred? Do you have moments of beauty juxtaposed against moments of terror? Because all of it is paradoxical in nature, and yet all of it is what we experience as human beings. Think about for a moment how the church so often testifies that God exists to end human suffering, and how many human beings have lived before you that have not ever experienced a life without suffering. Think about your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, and your great-great-great-grandparents. All of them lived in the shadow of unresolved suffering. We all lived in a world that we longed for suffering to be brought to an end, but ultimately that suffering still was part of the life that we experienced. And while there were dark times in the history, there were also these moments that you read letters or you hear stories about your family and where they came from, and you say to yourself, but there's also those moments. The most human thing that we do is we live in the shadow of unresolved suffering. And when you consider what that means for us today, I look at the life of Jesus Christ, and it all of a sudden becomes a profound reality about who we are and what it means to be human. Because when we talk about Jesus, this ultimate story about God becoming human, it's a story about how God lives in the shadow of unresolved suffering with us, where we don't have all of the answers to our questions. Jesus Christ didn't fix everybody's problems. Yes, he worked to bring suffering to an end in specific circumstances, but there was a lot of suffering that Jesus didn't end. Jesus even suffered alongside us in the story on the cross. And when you consider that most of us grew up with the belief that God's primary work was to bring an end to suffering, the older I've gotten, the less I've clung to that and started going to a different idea that I found to be very helpful. For me, the primary work of God is to teach us how to live in the shadow of unresolved suffering. How it can be that there is all this fear and terror and trepidation and rejection and standardized testing, all of those things exist, and how on earth we can find a way to respond to all of it with love. This reminds me of a very famous prank that took place on the TikTok. Is that how you say that? I'm not sure. Anyways, it's called a water bottle prank, and I don't know if you've seen it, but the whole idea is that you go to someone, if you're doing the prank, you go to someone and you say, do you want to see a magic trick? Everyone wants to see a magic trick, right? Just hoping for a little more enthusiastic response on that. I've never said no when someone's like, do you want to see a magic trick? I'm always yes. So you say, do you want to see a magic trick? There's a yes, it's enthusiastic. They say, great. They take out a water bottle, a plastic one. They place it on a table. They take out a coin. They say, watch this. They drop the coin in the water bottle. Then they take a blanket and place it over the water bottle, obscuring your vision. Then they say, alakazam. They take off the blanket, and there is the water bottle. Now, the person doing the prank leans over the water bottle and looks down inside it and says, it's gone through. The person who is experiencing the trick looks at the person and says, really? And they say, yeah, do you want to see for yourself? The person who the prank is being played on then looks into the water bottle like this. And at that moment, when they are looking to see if the coin has gone through the water bottle, the person playing the prank then takes both hands and slaps the water bottle, shooting the water directly into the person's face. My friends, it's time to draw a line in the sand. I am not a fan of this prank. I think it's a terrible prank. The first reason it's a terrible prank is because it requires the person pulling the prank to say, do you trust me? The person responds, yes, I trust you. And the person pulling the prank says, sucks to be you. What a joke. You are getting screwed because you trust me. The second reason I have a hard time with this prank is because it requires the person who is being pranked to enter a posture of vulnerability, right? Look at this kid, just ready to see some sort of magic, and he is opening himself up to being slapped in the face with water. And this, my friends, is an exploitation of his vulnerability. And when I look at this picture in this prank, the reason why it rubbed me the wrong way was because when you look at what it means to be vulnerable, I have found the more I've grown older, the more sacred vulnerability is. Because when we choose to be vulnerable, it is because we have hope that something good will happen. We are trusting that we'll be able to see a magic trick if we're willing to place our eye over the water bottle. Whenever we experience those moments of vulnerability, we say, I want to see something beautiful. I'm going to try and take a trip to go see something pretty. You get there and it rains the whole time. You're like, oh, figures. Every act of vulnerability is ultimately an act of hope that something good will happen. One of the great perks of my job is I get to officiate weddings. And I have to tell you, COVID, I have missed weddings terribly during this season. I've done a few small weddings every now and then, but there's nothing quite like a big, festive wedding. Now, if you have been to a wedding that I've done, you know that this is one thing that I do, but I'm a big believer that the whole homily that the pastor does should be about the couple getting married because, no one showed up and said, I can't wait to see what Craig has to say. That's not the point of weddings, right? So I sit down with couples before we do the wedding and I say, tell me your story because I would like to tell it at the wedding. And I've been to a wide diversity of weddings. I have loved doing these weddings. And I have found that whenever you start to tell the story of how a couple got together, everyone from every background leans forward on the edge of their chair. This is very interesting to me because everyone obviously knows how this couple's story ends. We're here at the altar, right? And yet there's still this sense of, oh, did it work? Did it actually play out? But the reason I think that everybody loves to hear these stories, particularly at weddings, is because the foundation of every love story is vulnerability. At some point during each of these stories pictured up here, there was one person who had to step forward and say, I kind of like you. And there was another person who heard that and said, I kind of like you too. And every time a couple gets together, there is this vulnerability that happens that ultimately is rooted in hope. Maybe if I take this chance, things might work out. Now, when I tell these stories, I don't go through people's whole dating history. That would be very strange and very weird, and people would be like, what are you doing? But what everybody knows in the back of their head when they hear these stories is that at some point, each of these people have faced severe rejection. There are stories where people have stepped forward and said, kind of like you. And the response is, we should just be friends. And those stories hurt and they sting, but they are still part of what it means to step forward in hopes that we can experience love. And when I think of the story of Jesus Christ, when God became human and human became God, this is a story about God showing us the sanctity of vulnerability. Jesus got to know people who he could both help and who he needed the help from. Jesus lived a life where he saw miracles and committed miracles of his own and saw what happened when those miracles ran out. Jesus fully experienced rejection by humanity because Jesus did everything he could to love humanity as well. The story of Jesus Christ is one of God's vulnerability. And I believe that we follow it. Anytime that we open ourselves up to the possibility that something good might be waiting for us. As adults, we get crankier because we've been rejected, we've been burned by the vulnerability that we've given ourselves. But there's something about children. My daughter and my son open their arms wide to the world and say, let me see all of it. For that, our children are our greatest teachers. My friends, may we follow the way of Jesus Christ and realize that vulnerability is the greatest act of faith. Because each time we open ourselves to vulnerability, we are opening ourselves in faith and in trust that something good may come of this, that something better may be on the horizon, and that we can truly see beauty once we open ourselves to see it.